Hello and welcome to Unleashed. I'm your host, Will Bachman. If you go to umbrex.com/unleashed, you can sign up for a email that I send out to subscribers where I send out the show notes every week in case you don't want to listen to every episode. You can know what's the latest. And I usually include some bonus material and free consulting resources every week as well. So check that out. Today, I'm delighted to have on the show Sri Kaza, who I've known for years. He's a former McKinsey partner, and he's the author of the forthcoming book, Unconvention, a small business strategy guide. Sri, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Will. Appreciate it.
So, Sri, people think McKinsey, they think, oh, Fortune 500, big companies. Tell us a little bit about, what led you to write this book and about your experience working with small businesses.
So I left the firm, McKinsey, around 12 years ago, I think, at this point. And I loved every minute of it. I know there's a lot of folks who have left and have pursued other things out of, seeking refuge. I really had a great time learning about business, engaging in business strategy. And so when I left, I was pursuing kind of an idea of entrepreneurship and a little bit of independence. I got my first stop out of McKinsey was to work for Tor Hagen at Viking Cruises, and he was a former McKinsey partner who'd become an entrepreneur, started a cruise line, and I was just so impressed with how he found the right balance. McKinsey, you're going to go do a ton of data, a ton of analysis, and make recommendations, and lots of other people have to sign on board before you move. And he was able to, follow his instinct, make decisions on the gut by the gut, but still, when it came to it, like use data the right way and use insights and strategy the right way. And it really inspired me to look more at entrepreneurship more broadly. After working with him, I went off to take on my own entrepreneurial endeavor with a company called the Tax Credit Co., which was focused on small businesses that typically have, less than 100 employees, maybe less than 500 employees. And what I focused on with that company was operationalizing their work opportunity tax credit business. When I first got into it, I thought the problem would be applying what I'd learned from McKinsey on sales operations, process automation, et cetera. But really what I discovered was, the customer, the small business customer just has so many things going on. They're not only the CEO of their company, they're also, the chief accountant, the CFO, and the garbage man too. They do everything. And it's so hard to get their attention. It's so hard to get them something of value. In the case of the Tax Credit Co., we were literally helping people get found money from the government. Credits that they weren't collecting that they needed to, that just needed to fill out paperwork to get. And you would be shocked at how much we spent on acquiring customers to give
Like,
free money to.
like what kind of tax credits?
So there's a tax credit called the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, where if you've hired somebody who was on some sort of government assistance, maybe
Mm.
food stamps, TANF, or maybe it was just an ex-con or somebody from a particularly unique district that had socioeconomic issues. If you hired this individual and they stuck on and you paid them for a certain amount of time, you'd be qualified to claim a tax credit up to
Hmm.
$2,000. On average, 1 out of 10 employees in like the fast food or call center space, in many of the service sectors, 1 out of 10 is one of these people. And so now you're thinking, I go up to somebody and say, okay, you hire, you've got 100 people, but you've got like 50% turnover. So you hire 200 people every year and 20 of them will get you $2,000. That's a lot of money. But now think about it like a business owner who's got a million things going on. And you see an email from one of my business development reps, and it might as well say, hi, I'm from Nigeria. I need your social security number and I can get you $40,000.
Hmm.
I need all this data from your company. I need to know about your employees and know all this stuff. The trust breaks down. You don't acquire the customer. So in my learning, as we built a very scalable backend, I learned, a big piece of this is go back to my roots as a consultant and think about the business from the perspective of the small business owner and think about what problems they actually have and how I can actually solve their problems for them. Or how can I just give them some guidance on where the big problems are? So, in that example, we were able to shift the conversation. Instead of telling people, hey, I can help you get tax credit, I need your social security number. we switched to just being informative, telling them, look, companies like you usually get about 40,000. Are you getting the 40,000? Talk to your accountant. Go find out. If your accountant can't get it for you, you can come back to us and we'll help you, right? But we just want you to know. And you break apart this selling motion from the introduction of the idea that you can get tax credits, and you just point out a few problems to people. And then if they've got the time, if they've got the energy, they'll do a little bit of research on their own. And when they realize the reason there's a whole industry for this is because it's a pain in the butt to do, then they
Right.
so we scaled that business really well. Of course, we had a major change in tax law where a ton of businesses didn't need that credit anymore or couldn't apply the credit anymore. So that really hurt our exit when we sold the company to Experian, but it really hurt our exit. Then I later went and joined another firm that was also selling to small businesses. This time it was small business lending. And in that world, what I found was very similar is if you think about the business from the perspective of the owner, as opposed to the perspective of somebody trying to sell them an offering, you can solve their problems, potentially solve their problems better. And then as a business who's helping these small guys, you can benefit too, especially when you keep them successful. So we took a similar philosophy when I got to that company to scale up again. We scale up maybe 10x in just 2 years. It was a really, really fun growth cycle. We hit COVID though together, and that also was a challenge for me. But hitting COVID at a time after you've lent a whole bunch of money to the small restaurants and retailers that all had to shut down, crushed our business. And we had built out a really fun, I think of it as a fun framework for building business cases and understanding the strategies of these small firms. It was a part of how we were going to go help them apply the funds and do well with it. And of course, like a third of these companies didn't survive COVID. But our company did. We got to a place where we were able to sell it. It was pretty successful in the sale, and I was pretty happy with getting a return for our team and finding the next place. But it nagged at me that like still a third or more of our customers didn't make it. And that's why I decided maybe I'll do some research. Maybe I'll do some McKinsey style research. We've got piles and piles of data. We worked with tens of thousands of small businesses, and I've got all this structured insight into their strategies, into their business plans, into their finances. There's got to be a chart in here. I didn't find a chart. Did a lot of analysis. Didn't find a chart, but I found a lot of great stories, and I was inspired then to put them together in a book because what I found was they often did live and die by the same strategic frameworks and rules that we use in the corporate consulting world. Everything from the five P's or I'm sorry, the five forces or the three P's or any of these fun B school MBA frameworks. Or they're in there, they don't know that they're following these things, but they've got their own unique attributes that the big companies don't have. So that's what I found was there's a lot more personality, a lot more intuition, and more of a commitment to something more than a profit motive. And as I was going through these stories, I put together a set of principles. I call them the underdog principles because I was thinking of these guys as underdogs when I started putting together the book. The underdog principles are positioning, proximity, and purpose. And each of those things are something that small businesses have that the larger guys don't. And they can use them to navigate the same strategic challenges that the big businesses do, but come out with a better answer for themselves, typically. And I'm happy to go through some of the details, but yeah, I thought for your audience, it'd be a great conversation to talk about things like positioning, where, I know a number of young consultants who've kind of left the firm, want to go start their own independent practice, or people who are on their path to an independent practice who are wondering, how do they position themselves? And I'm sure you've seen it too. A lot of folks try to be too general. It's hard to go out into the market and tell people, hey, I can do anything, because the market's looking for something specific. But it's also just as hard to say I'm very, very specific on something, because what if you miss opportunities to solve problems that you can solve? So this comes in this dilemma of positioning. But the small business, I think one of the things that really you'll see as an independent consultant, and you'd see as any other small business owner, is when you start to pick and get more confident in your positioning, you'll find there are more than enough customers to work with, or more than enough clients to speak with. Your positioning is not just kind of what you do, but it's also how people find you. So if you're out there saying, hey, I'm deeply specialized in A, B, or C, you're not talking about your generalist skills. You're not talking about how you're a great counselor. You're not talking about how you're a first principles problem solver. You're only saying, hey, I'm great at this one thing. Well, it turns out as you meet and interact with clients who find what you do interesting or even just adjacent to what they're looking for, they can learn about those other skills that you bring, as opposed to sticking your hand up and saying, hey, I'm a great generalist. I'm a good counselor. I'm a good advisor, ambiguous problem solver with a brand behind me. Like none of those things really stand out. But when you pick something that is different enough, it gives you a chance to have the conversation and it gives you a chance to have and establish something that's small, maybe niche is the right word, but valued.
What would you say differentiates your approach to thinking about strategy for small businesses from a lot of the other guidance that is out there already? What would you say would be, where you differ from kind of some of the existing books and guidance that's out there?
Sure. I call this a small business strategy guide where I would say I don't know that I'm giving any guidance directly, but the difference here is a lot of times you'll read these books that tell you kind of how to do something or what you should do in certain situations. And in this book, I start with really more questions that are intrinsic. Who are you? What do you want? I want you to define for yourself what your positioning is, what your purpose in this business is. And then when you kind of decided on those, then I can show you, look, here are a number of traditional business frameworks that I guarantee you most of your listeners are already familiar with. But you look at how you can apply these things that are particularly unique about yourself in those frameworks to have an advantage. So I would expect that, if somebody's read a lot of business books, to be very familiar with the concepts and the ideas shared here. But what's special is that it's more centered on the reader actually following along, asking these questions about himself or his business or herself or her business. And then as they apply what they've learned in the book, kind of rethinking their position or rethinking their strategy for, let's say, pricing or for customer loyalty or many of the other kind of challenges every business faces, you rethink it based on these principles.
Let's go through some of these principles and maybe you can illustrate them with some of those stories you collected. So, positioning you have as the ability to focus on a set of customers who value what makes you unique. Talk to me about that one a bit. What are some questions you encourage small business owners to ask themselves and maybe illustrate with a story or two?
Sure. Well, I'll illustrate with a very simple analogy, is more so than a story, although I do tell a little story about it in the book. Just take a parking lot at a venue for like a sports event or a concert. There are 20 options for you to park, all the way up to at the stadium or at the venue, and each one is an independent business, usually an independent business, owned and operated by just an individual. And every one of them has a different price. You've got the price at the stadium. I live in LA, so maybe people will be shocked by this, but you go to a Lakers game, I think it's like $50 to park at the stadium. It's ridiculous.
I'm
And
shocked that it's that low, but
oh,
okay. I live in New York, so
yeah,
50
okay, well
bucks,
there
that's
you
a
go.
great deal.
Yeah, you're like, oh, well, I do that. Uh, and then
How
and
much?
then there's the underpass, but below like the 10 and the 405.
All
No,
right.
no, the 10 and the 110, where you could park for $15. And there's a number along the way. And every one of these guys, they can't do anything about their location, right? But they've embraced it and they know, hey, I can charge this much for my location. And I've driven through LA for a bunch of different things. And it's interesting, anytime there's an event, the prices are different for every event. And
Hmm.
they're different based on the weather. Like for example, if you're close and you're not in the lot, but like, you're a block away, you can go from 20 all the way up to 35 if it's raining, right? And of course, the guy under the underpass is like not even taking, not even putting his sign up because it's not worth for him to stand out in the rain, when the weather's bad. So this is a simple example. I use pricing here to talk about value, but here's where these individuals have kind of locked in on their position and they know what they offer and they understand quite well the difference between what they offer and what the rest of the market offers, and they run their businesses accordingly. So when you're a small business and maybe you're a restaurant, you've got a location, you're on the east side of town versus the west side of town, right? Or maybe you're a consultant who's got a ton of experience in SaaS and, specifically billing in SaaS, right? As you build on that, that's where people find you. That doesn't mean that you have to make all these decisions about who you are and what you do based on where you're positioned. But if you embrace that positioning, you can then market yourself as something specific. You have the credibility to line up, and then you design the rest of your offerings around that one key landing place for your first conversation. Uh, and you can apply this in many other businesses around just being having a specific offering for a specific taste. And the reason I worded this about picking the customers who love you the most is small businesses have the freedom to piss off people or offer things that certain people don't like or don't want because they're going to focus on the ones that they care about. And you'll see this played out in a lot of different examples. But one of my favorites is like Black Rifle Coffee, I think they're called. They've picked a space, they're crushing it in their space, and they're okay to piss off a whole bunch of people because it doesn't matter. Now you don't have to be that broad or open, but the reality is sooner you embrace your positioning, you can use it in a lot of different strategic choices. How do you price? What do you offer, etc.
How do you incorporate the concept of agility and speed of decision making into your framework? Does that fit in somewhere? Because it
Oh, it
seems to me
absolutely does. It
that seems to
absolutely
be
does.
like one of the biggest advantages of a small business is the owner, alluding to what you're saying before with the cruise entrepreneur, at a company, there's all these levels of approval, submit your bid, it gets into the annual budgeting cycle. A small business owner can just decide, boom, we're going to do this, let's launch it tomorrow. Boom.
So I try to encapsulate that in the second principle of proximity. As a small business owner, you're making all the decisions, just like any CEO, you're at the top. You get to make the call on what to do and how to do it. But as a difference between you and the CEOs of big companies, you know your customers, you deal with them, you see them day to day. You're able to make a decision quickly to adjust, to offer more, offer less, based on how you're reading the rest of your customer's experience. I was studying kind of what happened with a lot of these businesses during and post COVID. And one of the things that really was interesting to me was a lot of individual businesses didn't wait to set up their standards on how their in-store experience would look like. They weren't going to sit back and just take government's either hands off or tight-fisted control, depending on where they're located. They made adjustments that fit what their customers wanted to see. It was really interesting to me. I saw because I was looking for data. I was looking for real cool scatter plots, et cetera, that would tell me something. But I saw even in the states where there was tons of freedom, right? So like California, where I live, in New York, where you live, there's just tons of restrictions. Everyone's like, yep, you can't do this, can't do that, don't even open, blah blah blah. Other states like Florida and Texas, where we had a huge number of businesses operating in those two states, they struggled. They actually saw bigger revenue declines on average than some of the California cities. And I couldn't understand why until, I actually had a few conversations with the owners that survived. There's a hair salon. I think it's a hair salon. It's a hair salon in Florida where everybody was allowed to do whatever they wanted, right? They didn't have to wear masks. Customers didn't have to so every store just kind of left it wide open. But because of that, they felt like people weren't coming. People were worried, but the overall answers weren't good for their particular market. So for their market, they wanted to show that they were still going to take care of some precautions. Definitely not as tight as the California standards, but they actually had a tighter set of precautions than the government was mandating. It was like, oh, well, right, because they had the freedom. But it wasn't just the freedom, right? They weren't going to wait for the government to tell them what to do. They didn't want the government to tell them. They wanted to go and understand their customers. They understood their customers. They had the same, concerns as their customers. So they did their own research and they laid it out on their own. And being able to make that decision quickly without the red tape and reflective of their customers' preferences is what kept them in much better shape than some of the chains that weren't implementing any practices because they were waiting for either senior people nationally to come up with a rule right? And if you're coming up with a national rule, I mean, how's that apply to all these different communities, different states, different attitudes? It doesn't work.
Tell me a little bit more about purpose.
So purpose was, I struggled with this initially, giving a good name. I spent 2 years at the beginning of my career living in Japan selling software. And what I saw there was some of the kind of core examples of small business, everything from, my favorite six-person ramen shop. I'd walk in, and I say six-person, it's one-man ramen shop, but there's six spots for six people to sit down and get their ramen. And you'd go through this process with them, and you would go through, get your ramen, you would love it. We never went as a group from the company. We'd all go to our own individual ramen places pretty much every time, but you'd sit down, you'd really enjoy it, and then we'd come back, and I thought, hey, this is no way to run a business. In fact, they didn't have waiters or waitresses. All they had was this vending machine out front where you pay the vending machine, you push a button, you get a ticket, and then you hand the
Yeah.
ticket to the chef. And it just, I couldn't get like why these chefs were so kind of heads down focused on really uncaring for the rest of the world other than their craft. But a colleague explained to me this concept of shokunin, which is concept of craftsmanship. So you'll hear about it in like Japanese knife making, or even the straw hats that the sumo judges wear, like comes from like years and years and years of practice at your craft. It was really celebrated there. So this shokunin concept is, some of the business owners I know, just they care about the pride in the work that they do. They care actually sometimes more about that than profit or growth or the compromises in product offering that it might take to get into other markets. And initially, I thought, well, that's not really compatible with business. And as I thought about purpose and I thought about kind of really what it meant was, you know what, you're the owner, you're the shareholders, you're the employee, you're the CEO. You get to decide what is the return on your investment. And if you're going to want to bring in profit and be rich, great. If you're going to want to bring home pride in your craft, great. If you're going to want to go and have an impact on the world and in your community, great. These are all your choices and purpose. But that's a degree of freedom, choosing your purpose, that big businesses don't have. Your competitors don't have. They're pursuing profit, they're pursuing growth. But as an individual owner, many of the people I know who've left consulting and kind of gone on to be independent didn't leave to go make themselves a ton more money. They left because they wanted some of the freedoms they get for doing this. I have a good story in the book about a friend who became an independent lawyer trying to get away from the law firm that kind of was enslaving even their partners. And it's really important to remind yourself when you're out there struggling to get that revenue or having a tough time because you got a dry patch in your pipeline. It's hard to recall, but you got to remember you did this because you wanted that independence, and that independence is what you value. And so when you make your decisions, remembering not to compromise your purpose, right, is pretty powerful. You don't have to pursue the path that the larger corporations pursue.
You are allowed to play a different game.
Yes.
I mean, sometimes you come across a business and like you can't get an appointment or they're fully booked. As a consultant, you think, why don't you just raise your rates? Like
Exactly.
there's this we have this farm in Pennsylvania and we raise like one or two cows every year and three or four pigs, and we take them to this butcher shop and we deliver the animal and they take care of it. You got to book like 2 years in advance to book a slot to take your pig. And you're like,
Wow.
okay, if you have that much demand, like why don't you just raise your rates?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
some people, I don't know, maybe they don't want to be embarrassed by telling their customers their rates are higher or something, but maybe they're just happy. Okay, I'm fully booked for the next 2 years. I don't have to worry about
Yeah.
sales.
Well, I mean, that's part of the reason I saw this a lot actually, and I struggled with it as a consultant. I'm always sitting there saying, raise your prices.
Yeah, raise your
But,
prices.
I discovered, there's more than just price that you want to get out of your customer, right? And I'm sure many of the people in your audience are familiar with the idea of customer excess benefit or pricing to value and understanding the customer's value versus your actual cost. I lay out a framework in the book on the basics, what we do with any company, like the garbage company I worked for, did some work for. We just took the prices up as high as we could, before you start losing customers. That makes sense because that's all profit. Why wouldn't you do that? Well, then you look at a small business and you say, look, I've created all this excess value. I think it's important for the small business to understand that value and learn how to calculate it, or at least learn how to think about it. But then they don't have to give all of that to themselves. They should very likely share it. But I do think they need to be conscious of what the benefits are, why they're sharing it. If they're sharing it because they want to encourage a certain behavior in the world, or they want to, grow at a certain rate, or they want to make sure their customers stay loyal. There's a number of reasons for it, right? But it should tie to your purpose. What am I trying to accomplish, right? As opposed to purely tying to profits.
Talk to me about what you are hoping to yourself do in the world with this book. Are you like now wanting to be a kind of coach or consultant to small businesses? Is your plan to, try to launch some kind of effort like that? Or is this more you just wanted to, get the concepts out there and move on to the next stage in your life? Tell me a little bit about what your personal plans are related to this.
Yeah, it's probably the latter. Let me just, again, a word of advice to anybody interested in consulting or working with small businesses. It was really, really expensive to get the small business owner's attention, and
Yeah.
they don't have a lot of money. So be careful if you want to stake your claim to individual attention. But I feel like that's a big reason why I wanted to get this out there is that there's not a lot of folks who are trying to boost them up without clawing back a chunk of profit. And maybe I'll do something more nonprofit oriented. Maybe I'll take the momentum from the book and help build tools, get something more wide distribution. I really do want to have an impact on, we got like 30 million of these entrepreneurs in the country who are out there, and probably going to be a lot more in the next couple of years as we see the markets changing and a lot of things shifting. But I think all these people are challenged and are getting lots of advice from people who have something to gain. And I would like for them to see, first of all of this advice through the lens of what matters to them first. So that's kind of the impact I'm trying to have. And yeah, kicking around maybe a nonprofit foundation or some other things. But in the short term, I am looking forward to getting back and doing, businessy type of stuff myself.
All right. Sri, where can listeners find out more about you and more about the book? Where would you point them online?
I can send them my website. My website is sri-kaza.com, SRI-KAZA.com. There they'll see the book. They'll see like a blog I've got where I talk about a bunch of interesting things. They can also subscribe to my Substack. Same thing, srikaza.substack.com. Just sharing my thoughts. As you can hear, I kind of have lots of random stuff to say. So if people like hearing random stuff, it's not a bad place to go.
And when is the book coming out?
September 23rd.
All right.
Books available for pre-order. So if you come to my website and check it out, or if you're listening to this and it's after September 23rd, hopefully you got the discount because you've already pre-ordered it and all those goodies. I know you mentioned, Will, that you give away a few things every once in a while to your subscribers. So I have a gift for you to email out or make available to the folks who are interested in this podcast.
What would that be?
Oh, well, they're going to have to come to your site to find out. But yeah, it's a gift. It's downloadable, and I think a lot of them would find some value in it.
All right. So if you are subscribed to the newsletter for Unleashed, we will include that link to the surprise offering that Sri is mentioned. Sri, hey, great. We'll include that link to your website in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining.
All right, appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.